Hello friends, in Indian economy, in Unit 1 up till now we have discussed the basics of economy. We talked about the three sectors theory and how the different sectors contribute to the employment and GDP of the country. We talked about colonialism and we had started discussion on how the colonialism has impacted the colonies. We also had a brief look at the history of colonialism in India, and we were in the middle of the discussion on economic exploitation of India as a British colony. And we had discussed how the Indian handicrafts industry suffered during the British rule because of the exploitative policies and practices of the British colonial rulers at that point of time. Now today, in the last session in Unit 1, we need to discuss how economic exploitation of India impacted the farming community, the farmers, the peasants. So let us start discussing that. First of all, what happened, please understand, a new land system was introduced under the Britishers. Earlier, let me tell you that there used to be zamindars in India since ages ago, and there used to be peasants who would work in their field and they would pay a part of the crop to the zamindar, or they would pay up some land revenue or lagan to the zamindar. Now this system existed since very long ago, and because of that there was a very cordial relationship between the peasants and the zamindars. Though the zamindars extracted the dues from the peasants, but the relationship was still very cordial, and the zamindars were considerate of the peasants and they were concerned about their well-being. So in a particular year, if the peasant is unable to pay up because of adverse weather conditions, they would not mind it a lot and they would not create a big issue out of that, or they would not force the peasant to pay up somehow. But when the Britishers came, they started introducing a new kind of a land system. Let me give you a brief idea what happened. They said, okay, fine enough, the zamindars would collect the revenue from the peasants, and then the share of the government they will have to submit to the government, they will have to deposit to the government exchequer. But they also said, now this was something that existed earlier, so there was no issue with that, but then they also said that if the zamindar is not able to pay up the government's dues, then the ownership of the land would be transferred to somebody else, to some new zamindar. So if the zamindar is now not able to extract the land revenue from the peasants, and then because of that, if he is not able to pay up to the government, then the land which he owned would get transferred to somebody else. A new zamindar would be installed in his place. So now it became very, very important for zamindars to retain their ownership. Now they had to pay up to the government, and where would they pay up from? They had to pay up. So they would actually start extracting from the peasants only. So now, just to save their own skin, they forced the peasants to pay up, because then only they could have paid back to the government, or they could have paid up to the government. So this was one thing which happened. And then some of these zamindars who lost their ownership and some other new zamindars were installed. Now these new zamindars, they didn't have that kind of age-old relationship with the peasants, and they were hardly concerned about the well-being of the peasant. They were hardly concerned whether he is comfortable paying up the dues, whether his family is okay or not, his family is starving or his family is well fed or not. So they were hardly concerned. So this traditional relationship also got disturbed. Fine. And ultimately the problem, it resulted into problem for the peasant class, because the zamindars were somehow able to manage, but the peasants were not able to manage, right? So many of the peasants also lost their traditional rights in the land. What does this mean? This means that they traditionally owned lands, but then this ownership had to be done away with. They had to part away with their land because they were simply not able to pay up their dues. So their land was transferred to somebody else. So these kind of things happen. Ultimately the brunt had to be borne by the peasants. Please also understand that the Britishers, under their colonial rule, they used to charge exorbitant land revenue. The land revenue rates were very, very high. So naturally the governments charge a high rate of revenue, which meant the zamindars would also charge a high rate of revenue from the peasants. Now these overburdened peasants, now why would they be overburdened? They would be overburdened because they have to pay up very high rates of land revenue, and many a times because of crop failure they were not able to pay up the revenue. In such situations, what would they do? They would then go to the local money lenders. They used to go to the local money lenders, and these money lenders, they would go and they would ask for loans so that they could pay up the dues to the zamindar. They could pay up the lagan to the zamindar. So they started asking for loans from these money lenders. Now these money lenders, they would charge very high rate of interest, which ultimately meant that if I have taken a loan as a farmer and I've gone to a money lender and have taken a loan, the interest rate charged is maybe 40%, 60%, and within no time, in just 2 years, the loan amount that is due, that I have to pay back to the money lender, is almost the double of what I had actually borrowed. So maybe I had borrowed just 1 rupee, and because of the high rate of interest, in another 2 years it is equal to 2 rupees. No, I now have to pay back 2 rupees. So this ultimately led to a situation when there was a debt trap. The farmers used to get entangled in a debt trap, and many a times the generations, the debt continued across generations. So the grandfather might have taken a debt, he might have taken a loan he was unable to pay in his lifetime. So the father, the grandfather's son, or the grandfather's grandson, the current generation, they had to pay up. So this became a debt trap in which the families were getting entangled and generations got entangled. So as I said, my grandfather took loan, he was unable to pay, so my father also had to repay, I also had to repay, and my son or my grandson might also have to repay. So the whole family across generations used to get entangled into the debt trap. Many a times, if these peasants were unable to repay the loans, they were forcefully evicted from the land. Earlier they were having ownership of the land. This was their ancestral land, which was passed on to them by their father and passed on to their father by his father. So that used to be ancestral land. But now, because they were not able to pay the loan, they were forcefully evicted from the land, and the land was given away to somebody else. So this happened. This used to happen at that point of time. Not only this, there was gradual commercialization of Indian agriculture. Please understand, in normal situation this would have been good. What is commercialization? Movement from food crops to cash crops. Food crops, generally farmers grow to feed their own family. Many a times they sell in the market also, but generally they grow to feed their own family. While on the other hand, cash crops are generally grown to be sold in the market. Fine. So in normal situation this would have been great, moving from food crops to cash crops. But here, under the British colonial rule, it was not a good news for the farmers. Why? Because the farmers were not paid well for these cash crops that they used to grow in their fields. First thing, they were forced to grow these cash crops. They were forced to move from growing food crops to cash crops, and on the top of it, they used to be paid much below the prevailing market price. Have a look here. They were made to sign bonds to cultivate and sell cotton and silk. Again, they are all examples of cash crops below the market price. So they were not getting adequate remuneration for their hard work. And naturally, if they are not going to get adequate remuneration for their hard work, they also had to now buy food for their family, because they were not growing food crops anymore. So if they are not getting paid well, how would they grow? How would they arrange food for their own family? So ultimately, it was the Indian peasant which got impoverished. And why did the Britishers encourage commercialization of Indian agriculture? They had to feed their own factories back there in Britain. I had talked about how in 1750s there was an industrial revolution in Britain. Sorry. And this industrial revolution meant that there were so many factories which were founded over there in Britain, and they needed raw material. So many a times, for example, we can take example of cotton. So there were so many cotton mills in Britain, and they used to run on the raw material, the cotton which was imported from India. So this was one reason why the Britishers forced the commercialization of Indian agriculture, so that these cash crops could be used by their factories in Britain. Fine. And not only this, many a times Indian agents were actually employed for this purpose. So they were employed to threaten the artisans into signing these bonds, into selling their products below market price. What do we mean by Gumasta? Indian agents. Actually, please understand, Gumasta is a corrupted version of government agent. So Gumasta, it became, in the common lingo, in the common usage, it became the word Gumasta. So these Gumastas were employed. They would threaten the artisan and buy their cash crop much below the prevailing market price. Not only this, many European planters were brought in from Europe and Western world, and they were made to settle in Bengal, for example, Darjeeling and the surrounding areas, and also the southern part of the Bengal. And they were made to manage plantations over there. So there were huge plantations, for example, jute plantations or indigo plantations, which were managed by them, but which were actually being run by Indian workers who used to work in those plantations. So these European planters were settled into parts of Bengal, and they were made to grow indigo in these plantations. So this ultimately led to commercialization of Indian agriculture. As I said, under the British rule, it had a very negative impact on the Indian peasants. Please also understand there were other aspects also, so let us spend a little time in discussing the other aspects. First, government also constructed an elaborate railway and irrigation network at that point of time. 1853, Bombay to Thane, the first train ran. But please don't think that there was any benevolence, there was any idea of serving the Indian populace behind constructing these railway lines and irrigation network. There were two reasons. First thing, the raw material had to be transported from the nook and corner of the country, from the rural hinterland of the country, to the seashores, from where it had to be shipped to Britain so that it could be then used to run the factories over there. And the best and the most efficient means of transportation at that point of time was railway. So railway network was constructed. Again, once the factories back there in Britain, they were able to process this raw material into finished goods. Now the finished goods had to be transported to India and from there to different markets in different parts of the country, so that these finished products could be consumed by the Indian population. Now, how do you transport these finished goods? Again, the most efficient means was railways, and this was one reason that the railway network was constructed by the Britishers here in India. Right? Likewise, irrigation network, so that more and more cash crops could be grown, plus less dependency on rain, less dependency on monsoon-fed agriculture would have meant a good crop, which would have in turn meant a better prospect of earning more land revenue from India. So this was the reason behind constructing the irrigation network here in India. Ultimately, these two changes led to intensification of commercialization of agriculture. Now more and more cash crops were grown in hinterland, rural hinterland, remote areas of the country, because now they could be easily carried off through train to the seashores from where they would be shipped to Britain. And again, the foreign made goods could also be easily distributed across different parts of the Indian colony. So this was the impact of the construction of the railway and the irrigation network. And ultimately, when foreign machine made goods flooded the Indian markets, what happened? Please understand that ultimately it led to the impoverishment of the Indian handicraft. They were not able to compete with them. They were not able to compete with these foreign machine made goods. There are reasons behind that. One reason is the foreign machine made goods, there was no import duty which was levied on them, so they were able to compete with the Indian handicrafts industry. Secondly, since they were made on machines, they were made much less expensively, they were less costly, and this led to a gradual demise of the Indian handicrafts industry here in India. Now, of course, another aspect which can be witnessed is that there was a lot of investment from Europe in India's banking and other businesses like trade and chemical and engineering industries. Now, please understand again, this happened because the investors and the entrepreneurs in the Western world, in Europe, in Britain, they were drawn by the lucrative prospects of such trade in India. So that was why they started investing, not because they wanted to benefit the Indian economy as such. So they started investing in these businesses. The whole idea was to serve the owner back home in Britain and to serve the economy of Britain only, and not to help out the Indian economy. And again, as I said earlier also, we had discussed that the government also tried to spread modern education and tries to educate Indians in scientific thinking, scientific logic. But again, the reason was that they wanted a dedicated cadre of workers, a dedicated cadre of clerks and workers and assistants who could help them run the administration of the country, who would be loyal to them, who would not question them at all, and who would be completely loyal to them. So this is why they spread modern education in India. This is why they started setting up colleges and universities. This is why they encourage English education in Indian schools at the higher levels. Then there was also a change in pattern of trade. Earlier, India used to export a lot of things, and over a period of time under the British rule, we started becoming exporters of raw material and importers of manufactured items. So we would, for example, export cotton grown in our fields, grown by our farmers, and this cotton would go to the British factories. They would process it into finished goods, clothes and textiles, and we would then import these clothes and textiles here in India. Again, this happened because there was not much import duty which was levied on such manufactured items from Britain. On the other hand, this also happened because here in India there was a certain amount of pressure that the farmers faced to move on to cultivation of cash crops. So ultimately we started exporting such raw materials. Cotton is just an example, and importing the manufactured items. And when you import manufactured items and export raw material, ultimately you would be losing out, because manufactured items, since they are value added items, some value has been added. Raw material, when you add some value with processes, you get a manufactured item. So value added items they are, so naturally they are going to cost you more. On the other hand, by selling raw materials, you are not going to earn that much. It's like selling apples is not going to get you a lot of money, but if you start eating the jam produced by that apple, the jam is going to be costlier for you to purchase. So this thing happened, and this impoverished the Indian economy, and this is what is known as the economic drain. Many a times the Britishers justified extracting land revenues from India and extracting huge amount of tax from India by saying that they also have to administrate the country. So the administration of the country, they have to incur some cost, and they said that our exorbitant land revenue, our high taxation rates can be justified because ultimately we are using them to administer you only, to administer India only as a colony. So in a way they were ruling us, and to carry out the administration of the Indian colony which they were ruling, they extracted resources from us only, right? So this is known as the economic drain, and this also led to famines. I have talked about the famine of Bengal in 1940s. There were so many different famines earlier which also took place. So in a way we have seen that how the British colonial rule led to economic exploitation of the country, though some of these things, some of these developments also had a good impact on the economy. For example, if you talk about the spread of modern education, or you talk about investment in banking, now this exposed Indians to these kind of businesses, banking and trade. Ultimately, some Indian entrepreneurs also started coming up. Likewise, some Indian people got educated and they started criticizing the British policies. They started generating awareness among the population against the oppressive British policies. So in that sense, some of these developments also had a good impact on the Indian economy and on the country as a whole in the long run. Thank you very much for your time. We have completed Unit 1, and very soon in the next session we'll move on to Unit